everybody, my name is Terry, and in this episode we're going to be doing a full service on a Honda VFR1200F. I'm going to change the brake pads, the brake fluid, the oil and filter, the coolant, the air filter, the spark plugs, the clutch fluid, the final drive oil, and check the steering head bearings. If that wasn't enough, I'm going to fit a centre stand too. Lots to do, let's get on with it. Now, the Honda VFR1200 is a very well-fared bike, makes it very aerodynamic and beautiful to look at, but it's a pain in the arse to get the fairings off. We'll start with the lower cowl. I've already done the 2 bolts on the other side. Now we undo these 2, and then you've got a plastic part that just pulls away, and then it all drops off. These big side fairings present the biggest challenge because they've got so many connections and hooks. So we'll start with just above the stator cover, this little screw in here which we need to undo. Now, tucked away behind the front forks here are 2 pot pins and a bolt, and you can see them marked as 1 and 2 on this diagram from the user manual here. To get the pot pins out, they've got a centre that you push on with something small like a little rod or a screwdriver, and then the pot pin will separate and you can pull it out. They're actually quite nice. And here's how these pot pins look close up. Quite a good design really. So the difficulty is not operating these things on the Honda VFR, the difficulty is actually getting into them. And out to the lower bolt, which is an Allen head. Here's another popper here at the bottom. There's another popper hidden away up here where no one would ever find it by accident. This is a very slightly different kind. Now when you finish with all of this, you should have 3 bolts and 4 poppers, one of which looks a little bit different, just like this one in my hands here. Now at this point, the whole thing's held on by 3 hooks and 2 bosses, and just watch how I take this off. We snap it off at the top, pull out the middle boss, and then move the whole fairing forward so we don't damage the hooks, and that's how you remove it. Exactly the same on the other side. And here we are, the lady is undressed. So first job is I'm going to change the rear brake pads, and to do that we need to get the cover off the shaft drive. There's 1 pop pin on the right hand side which I'm accessing through the wheel here. Now we've got 3 bolts to remove, 1 here at the front, 1 at the back, and then finally 1 on top. Once you remove the 1 on top, you need to just pull the trim out from underneath another piece of trim so that the whole thing will unclip and come away, and then you've got good access to the rear brake. And now we've got access, we'll make busy with the brake cleaner and the wife's toothbrush just to clean it all up a bit. Now we'll check the brake disc thickness against spec, should be a minimum of 5mm. We measure it at several different points. There's no need to remove the caliper in this procedure, but we do have to undo the pad pin, which you can see me doing here, and then pull it through towards you, away from the bike. With that done, it's a good idea to press the whole caliper towards you and away from you against the disc, and that way you're using the brake pads to push the pistons in a little bit to create a little bit of space. Once you've done that, you can pull one of the brake pads out. I'm giving it a little bit of encouragement by going in from the right hand side of the screwdriver just to press against one end, and then it'll come out easy as. And I'll get the second one out. Now although I'm using a screwdriver to encourage it here, I'm just pressing against the end of the brake pad. You've got to be really careful here, you don't want to scratch the pistons. The new pads are much thicker than the old ones, and it can be difficult to create the space for them, so here's a nice little hack for you. Just slide the caliper towards you and you'll easily get the first one in, and put the near one in, so the one on the left hand side of the brake disc. And then once you've got that one in, there won't be enough space for the far one, but you can create it by using a clamp like this. This is just a £10 clamp from B&Q. I've put the far end of it against the wheel spoke and the near end against the caliper, and then just by gently squeezing it, it pushes the caliper away, that retracts the pistons, and hey presto, you've got space for the other pad. Nice and easy. The right hand side of the pad, as we're looking at it here, goes into a little spring lug, and the left hand side has the hole through which the pad pin goes. Now a little bit of graphite grease on the end of the pad pin, and in it goes, and we'll screw it in and torque it up to spec, 18 Newton meters. And finally, a quick check to make sure the pads are located properly, and then I'll pump the brake lever and make sure that the disc is engaged by the pads correctly on each side. I'm going to leave the cover of the final drive off because we're going to change the oil later. Now to change the front brake pads. Now we have to take the calipers off, but before we do that we're going to loosen the 2 brake pins on each caliper. And we do this while it's still on the brake disc because it just holds it firmly for us and makes it easier. Now this is a high performance bike, so it's got radial brakes. That means the 2 pins that secure the caliper are in line with the forward plane of the bike. So I'll break the tension on those, then unscrew them with my fingers. Once that's done, you can just remove the caliper from the disc, and you'll see I've pre-positioned a bungee cord there, and that's so I can hang the caliper without stressing the brake lines. Now I know that these brake pads are shagged and need changing, and therefore I'm going to take the lazy man's approach, just use a screwdriver to pry them apart and push the pistons back. Clearly you would never do this with new brake pads. You can see there are 2 sets of pads, so the big ones and the smaller ones at the top. And on the left hand side of the bike, the one we're looking at here, those ones on the top, believe it or not, are operated by the rear brake. On the right hand side, all the pads are operated solely by the front brake. Now I'm going to undo the pad pins, and once the thread is out of the hole on the far side, I'll use this little screwdriver just to poke those pins through. And as soon as the pins are removed, then the retaining spring on the top of the caliper can come free and the pads themselves can drop out. So let's pull all 4 pads out and have a look and see what kind of condition they're in. Now you can ignore the marks here, I made those with a screwdriver, but the wear is definitely such that they need replacing. And just as with the rear brake, we'll measure the discs and make sure they're within spec on both sides. Now the front discs are thinner than the rear one. Now I'll give the whole caliper a good clean, focusing on the area around the pistons so they're not dragging dirt in and out of the cylinder as they operate. Now compressed air is quite useful here for getting the bits out, but if you're going to do this then wear appropriate protection because brake dust is not good for your lungs. Time to put the new brake pads in now, and I've pushed the pistons back just using my fingers. We put the pads in, it's obvious which way up they go, and then we get the clip in. That's not quite so obvious, but you will work it out, and then we put the pad pin through the middle. Now as you're putting the pad pin in, to get all the holes to line up, you just need to use your fingers of your right hand, as if you're orientated like me here, just to push up from underneath. That aligns everything, and then we will screw in the pad pin, and we will make sure that we get that to the correct torque a little bit later. Once they're in, we'll separate them with our fingers. And now into the 2 smaller ones, which for this caliper are operated by the rear brake. But it makes no difference how you operate them, they all go in the same way. Pads in, clip on, pin through the middle. Then with the new pads in, we'll just slide the caliper carefully back over the disc, put the bolts back in, and then tighten them up to spec. Now the Honda manual will tell you that you need to use new bolts every time you do this. From my point of view, provided you inspect them, there's no damage to the threads, you clean them up and use the thread lock, you're good to go. And now with the caliper securely on, we can torque up the pad retaining pins. And this is how it should look when everything's done up correctly. And the procedure for replacing the pads on the other side on the right hand caliper is exactly the same. Next job is to bleed the brakes and replenish the brake fluid. My setup involves just using a plastic hose over the bleed nipple, a ring spanner and a jam jar. You don't need any specialist kit for this. And what we do is we just squeeze the brake lever and then open the bleed nipple with the spanner, close the bleed nipple again, and then gently let the brake lever out. We just repeat this process, topping up the fluid in the reservoir as we go. And I just keep doing this until the fluid that's going into the jam jar is completely clean, so we've pushed all the dirty stuff out. Now because of the way the brakes on the VFR are configured and the fact that they're linked, you must start with this bleed nipple here on the left caliper. This is the lower of the 2 bleed nipples because that is what's operated by the front brake. The bleed nipple that's above it at the top of the caliper is the one we will do later on. Now over to the right hand side of the bike, which only has 1 bleed nipple, so no scope for confusion, and we'll just follow exactly the same procedure. You can see I'm making use of cable ties here and the frame of the bike just to make sure that the hose goes up from the bleed nipple and then down into the jam jar. Now once I've bled both sides of the front brake, I'm going to put together the brake fluid reservoir again. This has a little white baffle plate which sits on top of the liquid to stop it sloshing around, and then a diaphragm, then a plastic cover, and then the black cover which goes on top, which is just secured by 2 screws. These are JIS head, which look a bit like Phillips head, but it's slightly different, and you need to make sure you've got a JIS screwdriver, because you will be in a world of hurt if you strip those screw heads. Now, when the bike is on my hydraulic lift here and the front wheel is secured by a chock, you cannot move the handlebars from left to right, and unfortunately you do need to move the bars fully to the left in order to get that reservoir level so that you can fill it up to the top. So knowing this and knowing that I'm going to put a centre stand on later, which will make this easier, I'm just going to seal it up for now, not quite full, and I'll come back and top it up later. And to make sure that I don't forget, I'm just going to put a little label on the top reminding me to fill it up to level once I can move the handlebars to one side, because we all forget things. Now, to bleed the rear brake, we need to get access to the rear brake reservoir. We start by turning the key in the back and getting the seat off. Then we remove the small plastic silver fairing, starting with a popper on the bottom and 2 bolts on the top, both Allen head screws. Then we can remove the fairing and gain access to the rear brake fluid reservoir. Now back to the front left brake caliper, and we're going to undo the little rubber cover on top of the uppermost bleed nipple. Then put a ring spanner on top, set up the hose into the jam jar, making sure it goes up before it goes down so we can bleed the system. Now we'll take off the cap and the diaphragm so it's easy to top up the fluid as we go. And now you can have a good laugh at my expense as I turn into a contortionist, because what I've got to do is operate the rear brake pedal and the spanner, and I have to twist around the bike in order to do this. And just like with the brake pedal on the handlebars, you have to push the pedal down, open the nipple, close the nipple, and then release the pedal slowly. And as we do this, we just keep topping up as we go into the brake fluid reservoir until we start to see clear fluid going into the jam jar. And you can see here the old stuff looks pretty murky. And finally we move to the rear brake caliper, which only has 1 nipple, nice and simple. Set up a hose arrangement and then repeat the whole procedure. Now the reason we have to do this is because brake fluid is hygroscopic, which means it absorbs moisture, and water is compressible, and that's why you get spongy brakes. So here we go through it all. It's a bit of a nose, but once it's done it's very satisfying to feel how firm the brakes are again. Next job is to change the engine oil. First we'll start the bike, let it run for a few minutes so it warms the oil up, and that will help it to drain easier. Now the customer has said that he thinks the exhaust is blowing a little bit, so while the bike's running I'm just going to have a look around, see if I can hear or see anything untoward, and there is nothing obvious at all, just sounds like a normal V4 to me. Now I'll take off the oil filler cap, which is just above the clutch cover. If you don't do this, the oil will drain really slowly. The drain plug's a bit awkward because it's tucked away behind the exhaust header pipes here, so it's best to get in there with a socket and crack the tension and then move in the drain bowl, so otherwise you won't have room to work. The oil filter, by contrast, is very nicely positioned at the side of the bike and easy to get to with a socket. And I've been to the local Honda garage to get 2 new washers, one for the oil and one for the coolant. It's best to use new washers, but it's not absolutely essential. Contrary to popular belief, Honda do not use crush washers. It is essential though to make sure you torque up the sump plug properly. Too much and you might strip the thread, and then you will be in a very expensive world of hurt. The manual also requires you to measure the oil filter boss. The screw that sticks out should be 16 to 17 millimeters. Before we put the new filter on, we'll just put a little bit of oil around the seal and also around the screw thread. No point putting any oil in the filter itself. It goes on horizontally, it just spill everywhere. Now we'll torque up the oil filter itself, not too much here, just 26 Newton meters. Now to put the new oil in, we need to put in 3.2 litres. We've got a 4 litre can here, So if we subtract that, there should be 0.8 of a litre left once we've poured it in, and that's the easiest way to measure it as you go. So in it goes, glug glug glug, and then back on with the oil filler cap. And then finally we'll start her up, make sure the oil light goes out, check for any leaks, and then once we've turned her off and waited a couple of minutes, top up as necessary. Right, time to do coolant next. First job, go and make a cup of tea, let the bike cool down. You do not want to try and take off the cap from a hot radiator, you will scald yourself. Now we'll take the cap off the overflow reservoir, which is tucked away behind the clutch cover here. This is the coolant drain on the bottom of the water pump. I'm just going to crack the tension off and then get in there with a bowl. It will shoot out with some force. Wait for all the coolant to drain, but don't discard the used fluid just yet. You'll see why in a minute. And then once it has drained, on with the new washer and the old bolt, and then torque it up to spec. Now I've poured the old fluid into a measuring jug, and that's telling me that I've removed 2 litres from the system. And it's important to know this because when you top it up, it can be a bit of a guessing game when you're trying to get the air out of the system. And so it's really good to know how much you've taken out to make sure that you replace the same amount. First thing, I'm going to top up the overflow reservoir by the clutch cover here, and I'm using a syringe because it's the easiest way to get it in without spilling it. Then into the radiator main cap itself, bit by bit, because the coolant will bubble back and gurgle towards you and spit out if you try and do it too quickly. Now for the next bit, you have to turn on the engine and warm up the coolant. Now the principle here is as the coolant gets hot, it will start to bubble, it will agitate the mixture, and it will help to expel some of the air, and then as it does that you can gently top it up until you put all the coolant in that you need to. And it helps to rev the engine a little bit as well, but don't overdo it or you'll get coolant everywhere. Keep topping up until you're happy you've expelled all of the air that you can and you've got all the coolant in that you can, and then replace the cap. And then finally check that the overflow reservoir has a level between the 2 lines, the maximum and the minimum. For the next bit of the service, we've got to get the fuel tank off, so we'll start by removing the trim, which is just below on each side. Then the fuel tank side panels, which have a little popper hidden just behind the fork legs. And 2 Allen head bolts, one at the front and one at the back. Then you're just left with some little plastic lugs that attach it to the front fairing, so just carefully prise those apart. It'll come off, and it's exactly the same on the left side. Then undo the 2 bolts to hold the fuel tank at the front. Now I'm raising the tank and using just a block of wood on top of the air filter housing to hold it up so I can see what's what. There's a small black plastic shroud over the main fuel line into the fuel pump that just pulls straight off. Then off with the brown electrical connector, which is what powers the fuel pump. Now we depressurise the fuel system by turning on the ignition, starting the bike, and then just waiting until it cuts out itself because of fuel starvation. And with that done, we now disconnect the negative terminal of the battery to completely power the bike down. Now we remove the black electrical connector from next to the fuel pump. Now the towel or rag to catch any residue fuel, I'm going to disconnect the main fuel hose. And I found it easiest here to use a small pair of clamps just to hold in the ears and then pull the hose off. Saves you having to use 3 hands. The air vent line and the fuel overflow hose are really easy to remove, and you just have to unhook them from all the little retaining clips that feed them around the side on the bottom of the tank. Then we remove the nut on the tank hinge, withdraw the long bolt, and we can remove the tank, making sure first that we've got somewhere safe to place it where it won't get damaged. Now, in order to get to the spark plugs, we've got to remove the air filter and its housing, and the first job we'll be doing that is to take away the plastic air scoop on each side. This is easy enough just to wiggle off its housing, and it's the same on each side. Then we remove all of the bolts that hold on the air filter cover. Now, there are a shit ton of these and they're quite deep, so the use of an electric screwdriver is a bit of a godsend. Once they're off, we can lift the cover off the top. Now, I will admit this looks very dirty, but the Honda engine sucks a lot of air, and that's why you need to replace it regularly. This is quite normal. Next, we'll remove the air filter itself, which is just held in by 2 screws, and we'll put the new one in once we change the spark plugs and we're reassembling the bike. With the air filter removed, you can see the 4 velocity stacks, one for each combustion chamber, and these 2 rather weird plastic bottles. What they do is they alter the resonance of the air in the airbox and make the engine sound nicer. Simple as that. Now, the next bit of this process might seem very complicated, especially if you follow the user manual and you've got a sort of brain which insists that you need to know what everything is called. But this is what I would sum it up as. You need to disconnect and remove everything that stops you getting that airbox off. So you need to, as I'm doing here, take the velocity stacks off, 1 screw in each one, use an impact driver if they're jammed, because sometimes they are, undo all the pipes, disconnect all the wires until you can take it off. Simple as that. But photograph every stage and connection or video it so that you put it all back exactly as it was before. I'm going to change the 2 front spark plugs first because they're the hardest ones to get at. First of all, we've just got to pull the ECU up and just lay it out of the way. No need to disconnect anything here. With that done, you can get your hand in. I'm going for the right hand one first, and I'm going for the direct ignition coil, which is on top of the spark plug. Get your fingers in and pull it out. And there it is, there's one of the coils. Now we get the spark plug tool and we lower it gently into the hole. And this takes just a little bit of feel. You've got to feed it down with your fingers. Get sure it's located over the top of the spark plug. And once you're sure it's on, then we can get a wrench onto the top and crack it open and start to unscrew it. Just the normal ring spanner is perfectly alright for this. And they shouldn't be in too tight really. So once the spanner's done the hard work, we should be able to just get hold of the top of the tool with our fingers and twiddle it off. And then we can have a good look at the spark plug and see what sort of condition it's in. And this one looks to be in really good condition. It's not pitted, the gap's about the right size, it's a nice light tea colour, no dark staining. Looks good. However, I'm going to replace them all anyway because it's not clear from the service records I can see when they were last changed, and the spark plugs themselves are not that expensive. We've done all this work to get in here, let's change them out. So it's in with the new plugs and then on with the plug caps, the coils, and for these it's very easy to not quite get them home. So I put them on and then just keep pushing down and inspect with the torch to make sure there's no gap between the edge of the coil and its housing. And now we'll replace the ECU which sits on top of the plug caps and forward of the airbox. And now we just repeat the procedure for the plugs at the rear, which are much easier to access. Put the airbox back on, reconnect all the fixings, put the velocity stacks back in, and then put the new air filter in. This is just a reverse of what we've done before, so I'll speed it up so I don't bore you to death. here you can see just how grimy the old air filter was. Now it's back on with the fuel tank, and as I move around the bike to tighten up the nut on the end of this bolt, I make sure the tank is supported so that we don't crush any of the connections. Now it's simply a matter of reconnecting everything that we took off before. And with the tank reconnected, we'll put a little bit of gas in, start her up and make sure there's no leaks. Now the customers asked me to fit a centre stand to the bike, and I'm very pleased about that because it makes the next few jobs that much easier. This is a centre stand that I bought from a scrapyard, but I've got the fittings, the two springs and all of the bolts from a Honda dealership. I would much rather have a good part from a scrappy that's an original Honda part than try and get one of these new aftermarket parts on. I think they're just better quality, and I've had really good experiences with scrap yards. They normally deliver really quickly and they do exactly what they say in their adverts. This stand is in excellent condition, but it's just got some surface rust and pitting on the paint, so we'll get it back to the bare metal where we need to, and then we'll go on with the hammerite paint, and then it'll be good for another 20 years. So to fit the stand, first of all we're going to put some grease inside the holes through which the little axle goes. Then we'll line it up with the holes on the bottom of the bike and put the axle through the middle. And you'll see on the near side of the axle there's a little hook, and that locates into this pin. And this serves two purposes. The pin is what the spring's attached to, and it's where that little hook goes in to make sure that it keeps the shaft in line. On the other side of the bike there's a washer either side and a split pin, and that keeps everything in place. Now the spring's quite an unusual arrangement. There's a big spring and a small spring, and the small one goes inside the big one. So here's me putting the big one on there onto the lug on the stand. You can buy a special tool for this, but I think a couple of cable ties and a screwdriver works perfectly well, and a smaller spring just one cable tie because it's a bit weaker. Once you've located it over the hook, you can just cut it off with a Stanley knife, pull it away, Bob's your uncle, you've got a stand. Okay, let's get it off the hydraulic lift and see if the centre stand works. Now when I'm moving a big heavy bike like this, I think it's safer just to put it in gear and then control the bike with the clutch. You can see me doing this with my left hand, because if you try and control it with the front brake by reaching across, you can very easily unbalance yourself. It's also a good idea to get anything away from your feet, which I have definitely not done because I'm an idiot. Now we'll wheel it back in and use the centre stand for the first time. This is a really good design, I think, because it involves just pushing down with your foot, putting a bit of weight on it, and hardly any lifting and pulling. It goes onto the stand really easily. It lifts the back wheel off the ground, and it makes it easier to work on. The stand also allows me to move the handlebars safely over to full lock. Now I've already topped up the brake fluid, and I'm going to move the handlebars all the way over to the right now, and that will level up the clutch fluid reservoir, which is the next job. The bleed nipple for the clutch fluid is just tucked away on the left hand side of the bike here. I'm just getting off the rubber cover, and then it's a little bit easier to access things if you move the fuel vent hoses out of the way. So we can get a ring spanner over the end, a tube and a jam jar, and the method is exactly the same as you would use for the brakes. So making sure that we've always got fluid in, this is .4 just like brake fluid, in the reservoir, so that we never leave the drain uncovered and suck air in with the lever, undo the nipple, close it again, slowly release the lever and repeat, and just keep going that way until we get all the fluid through. And the purpose of this is to get rid of the old fluid and get the clean fluid in, and you can see from the jar here that the clean fluid's at the bottom where it's flowing in and the dirty stuff's at the top. Now we'll get the top back on the reservoir, so it's diaphragm plastic cap and then the black cap on the top. Get everything screwed down and then using a towel and paper to clear away any residue, because that fluid is not good for paint. We'll change the final drive oil next. This is pretty simple. First of all, we'll remove the filler cap. That will help the oil flow out better. This is the drain cap down here, which has got an Allen head, and then we'll just crack the tension on that and then unscrew it, and out comes the fluid. Don't get a huge amount out, 200 maybe 250 mil, something like that. Now you can turn the wheel a little bit, that can help get the last little bit of oil out, and once that's done we'll put the drain bolt back in and then torque it up to spec. Now I've actually done this wrong. When you refill with the oil, the bike should be on its side stand. Thank you ever so much to a viewer for pointing this out. Now you put the new oil in until it reaches the base of the aperture that the filler cap goes into. And before you put the filler cap back on, just check that the O-ring is good, replace it if necessary, and rub a little bit of oil on it, and then we'll torque this one up as well. Now we'll finish up by putting the final drive cover back on. That's 3 bolts and a popper pin from the inside of the wheel to the other side of the bike. Just out of camera shot here is my beautiful assistant. She doesn't want to be filmed. She's sitting on the back of the bike, and that allows me to move the handlebars from left to right, so I can feel with the fingertips if there's any notchiness or stiffness at all in the steering head bearings. I've already tested them as well by gripping the forks and making sure there's no free play, but I didn't film that. So steering head bearings are good, no work required. And with the steering head bearings checked, all that remains is to put the fairings back on, which I'm sure you don't want to watch a 10-minute video of, and then a test ride to make sure everything is good. And I will put that on the end because it is the most fun part of any service. Thanks so much for watching. Hope it's been of help. Please leave some comments.